Good evening again to all of you. I'm Dr. Helen Blyer, Director of Continuing Education here at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. We'd like to welcome you back to our third Shaft lecture, exploring how the divine darkness convicts the sin of racism. We'd like to remind you that links to all three of these lectures will be provided early next week to you via email if you registered for these lectures through our Continuing Education website. Please remember again that we are hosting this via Zoom webinar, which means that your interaction is made possible through the Q&A and chat buttons at the bottom of your screen. You all have been posting some wonderful questions, and I'm not the only one who says so. Our guest agrees heartily, and the questions really enrich our conversation. We'll once again have time for questions at the end. If you find the visual of the text in these pods distracting, you can use the button in the upper left-hand corner of the pod to close it. Tonight's interlocutor will be Will Robbins. Will is a third-year student here at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. He's originally from Birmingham, Alabama, having moved to Pennsylvania in 2015 and having entered the ordination process with the Episcopal Diocese of Central PA in 2017. He is now a candidate in that process and anticipates returning to rural PA as a parish priest with his spouse and his brand new baby boy, Aeneas. And now I am delighted to welcome again our guest, the Reverend Dr. Sarah Coakley.
Thank you so much, Helen. And anticipatory thanks to Will, with whom I've already had extremely interesting interchanges in advance of this evening. By way of introduction, let us take stock for a moment at the start of this third and last lecture in the Shaft series to clarify where we have been so far and the tasks that now still lie ahead of us this evening. In providing in lecture one, what one might call a thick description of life in a Boston jail, I attempted to give flesh to the thesis that racism there functions more densely and obviously than in the general world outside as a projective category of opprobrium and blame, allowing state punishment to extend well beyond the mere fact of sentencing and imprisonment to manipulated conditions of violence and assault. Yet it is also in these conditions of intensified social degradation and symbolic reinscription of systemic racism that practices and actions that resist, undermine, and transform what this system is attempting also become, I believe, the more apparent in their efficacy. As I tried to document, a simple act of shared silence in solidarity and peace in this context is one of extraordinary power, both personal and political, and more especially if it conjoins those traditionally, albeit questionably, labeled black versus white. We turned in lecture 2 last night to reconsider the theological notion of sin in the light of its manifest capacity to garner complex baggage from the more evanescent modern notions of gender and racism. Far from tidying or rationalizing this picture, however, we were forced to acknowledge that sin itself is a notion that carries from the myth of the fall what I called unbearable theological contradictions. And if these are too quickly resolved or tidied in the conscious mind, the habit of projective blaming becomes the more seductive, and thus, ironically, given that a key feature of the original Genesis narrative is to expose this propulsion to blame the other, freezes into a kind of false self-justification. After focusing the spotlight afresh on how the category of desire operates in the text of Genesis 3, and its apparently key role, both in the original idea of the image of God and in the moment of original temptation and the propulsion to sin, I made the constructive proposal, in critical conversation with divergent patristic interpretations, that sin should be fundamentally construed as desire that is misaligned or misaggregated, that is, as any idolatrous propulsion of desire, in which God is not the final directional goal of our longing. It follows, I suggested, that if the seemingly irresolvable tugs of the state of sin result in this human condition of conflicted desires and projections, so likewise will the equally mysterious resolution of these tensions reside there also, in our painful sorting in the groans of desire in prayer in the Spirit, and in our growing apprehension of the implications for desire of being drawn thereby into suffering, dying, and rising with Christ. But this is a pneumatological project note, not a human achievement. The image of God besmirched in the fall, therefore, is an image that only Christ can appropriately mirror back to us as the true divine desire of the nations. The task then, as we have repeated, is an ascetic one, the systematic sorting, testing, and purifying of desire in the crucible of the Spirit, and for the sake of union with Christ. I ended yesterday's lecture with an appeal to the remarkable work and example of Howard Thurman. For in Thurman's work, we see precisely in marked contemporary form this acknowledgement of the purification of desire as a discipline, Thurman's own word, to which everyone, his words, white, black, oppressor, oppressed, rich, poor, is called in the context of racism. This is both a highly contentious and a courageous proposal, since remarkably it is applied by Thurman with equal force across the barriers of race, racism, gender, and class. In other words, across the systems of human power. Only by the regular practice of the dispossession of desire, says Thurman, by allowing God's mighty tyranny, his words, access to one's own well-fortified castle, will the two-way negative psychic conditions of racism begin to shift. That is, the healing of memories, the healing of wounds of resentment, anger on the one hand, the exposing of prejudice, violence, domination, self-deception, and denial. Thurman does not comment here at this point, oddly, that of course this project is not equal. Whether you're on the side of the oppressed or the oppressor makes literally all the difference in the world, despite the fact that the two states are curiously and dialectically entangled and related. But in all this, Jesus' ministry to the dispossessed is Thurman's primary model. Relentlessly in all his writing and his preaching, he holds the churches themselves up for judgment against the example of Jesus himself, and insists afresh that it is, of course, the dispossessed who always start closer to the kingdom. But what then can be now our best theological resources for thinking through in more systematic detail this perilous and complex process of the sorting of desire that I have suggested is key to resisting the conditions of systemic racism? This now seems to be the task that centrally confronts us and will exercise us crucially in this last lecture. Whereas Thurman's sources were, of course, first and foremost the New Testament, his profound formation in the Black Baptist tradition, what he learnt at the knee of his former slave grandmother, and then the influences of Quaker thought and practice mediated to him in part via his role model, Rufus Jones. Those were his resources. And whilst I also share many of those, my own proposal is that we re-resource at this point in our own theological discussion to look at the systematic account of the purification of desires in relation to questions of race and class in the great 16th century Carmelite writers and monastic reformers, Teresa of Avila, 1515 to 1582, and her great friend and confidant, John of the Cross, 1542 to 1591. And before I set off on this task, which will form the substantial core of tonight's lecture, Will would like to come in, I think, and ask me a systematic or theoretic question.
I'm breaking in a little early, aren't I? But I think before we proceed to John and Teresa, I think it's important that we discuss a little bit more about this method of, excuse my French, everyone, ressourcement, this return to sources. Could you explain a little more and just carefully describe to us how it's different than just simply proof texting the church fathers and mothers?
Yeah, exactly. So I'm taking the French word comes from a very important group of French Jesuits under the influence particularly of Henri de Lubac, who formed such an important propulsion towards the Second Vatican Council reform in taking a church, a Catholic church at that point that had become in many ways rigidified by a particular reading of Thomas Aquinas, back to the complexity and richness and diversity of biblical resources and patristic resources, which of course lay behind Thomas Aquinas. And so that's where this name comes from. Now, in my case, it's part of my method, which I laid out in the first volume of my systematics, to utilize this idea of ressourcement in a rather new and different way, I think. So I'm thanking you for asking me. It's not that I have already decided what I want to say, and then I go on a raid to find people who've said the same, although you might sort of suspiciously wonder whether that could be the case. What I'm guided by here, first and foremost, is what are the resources in the Christian tradition which, in the case of these profoundly problematic questions that we're confronting in contemporary life, questions of gender, questions of race and racism, questions of class differentials, what are the resources that the churches have tended to forget? And their forgetting of them has actually partly been a bulwark in the setting up of systems which we're now trying to release ourselves from. So that's my first criterion. And I go on a quest to find materials in rather unexpected and sort of lost dark places that might jolt us into new awareness. And my second criterion is this, that my whole systematic project is attempting to recombine several dimensions of theology and practice that often are kept in separate boxes. In particular, what is now called spirituality, which I think is a slightly unfortunate term because it's sort of commodified as something you might like to have as an extra for self-examination and self-development. I don't think it's that at all. I think it's devastating. You know, this is the spirit we're talking about. And so how have the texts that our modern tradition has called spirituality and kind of siphoned off into a corner for people who might like to take courses in that, how does that relate to our kind of core curriculum of systematic theology and theological ethics? And so when we try and bring some of these together again, we should be disturbed, frankly. We should be destabilized. So the cynic in you will say, oh, she just went off to find somebody who was saying what she wanted to say anyway. I'm saying, I read these people, they disturbed me, and I wondered what it would mean to bring them into the heartlands of what we're trying to do more centrally in our doctrinal exposition of the faith.
So as ressourcement, you mentioned the word forgetting. Is it simply just remembering, or is it also just the sense of wrestling these sources away from where they've gone? I'm familiar.
I think it's both.
Yeah, I'm remembering back to Dr. Van Driel's class when he had us read J. Cameron Carter, who is doing this exact thing, this kind of wrestling the sources back. Is there something similar going along here?
Absolutely. I mean, Jay and I have been, as it were, brought up in the wake of the French ressourcement people, who also did this because they were particularly excited by patristic sources that had been regarded for a long time as actually slightly outre and not completely orthodox. Origen, Gregory of Nyssa, Maximus Confessor. Eastern sources that the West had ignored, or Eastern sources that had for various reasons not been regarded as mainstream. And so in Jay's book on race, he also recapitulates dimensions of Gregory of Nyssa and his attack on slavery, for instance, which is so unique within the early patristic system.
Right.
So no, I think we're engaged in a very similar task. And the only interesting question is, how do we constantly open ourselves to readings which are not at the core? And this happened to me personally when I was engaged in my 20s for the first time in the practices of prayer. And I thought, I want to read what these fathers had to say about prayer. And I realized that these were not the text I'd ever been asked to read in my courses. Origen on prayer, Tertullian on prayer, Augustine's letters on prayer. They were never in the core courses on their doctrinal content, but they should have been, because they threw that doctrinal content into a completely new light, which was utterly authentic to the authors concerned. So there is a hermeneutics of suspicion here, which asks, why is it that certain texts have been prioritized over others in our modern doctrinal curriculum?
Right. Well, let's get on with it.
Okay, here we go. So now I have to justify why the Carmelites, why Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross, and why is this not just completely random? And if you're non-white, you may be particularly wondering why one should choose these particular interlocutors. So there are several cumulative considerations that guide my choice of these two great Carmelite reformers as key conversation partners for the confrontation of the contemporary riddle of desire, racism, and sin that we have been trying to chart in these lectures. Here I must comment first on some salient features of the 16th century early modern world into which John was born, and then on the often missed systematic significance of his theological oeuvre. Together, these factors will provide a justification for my own intended ressourcement here. It may indeed seem odd to appeal to apparently obscure mystical theologians of the Counter-Reformation period to goad and clarify our contemporary racial malaise, but I'm going to try and convince you of their particular applicability. First, 16th century Spain, as is well known, was a context in which renegotiations of identity, and especially racial identity, were in particularly significant transition. On the one hand, the expulsion, or rather forced conversion, more usually, of the Jews, and then of the Moors, the Muslims, was as recent as 1492 and the years immediately following. Yet at the very same time, as Christopher Columbus notes at the start of his celebrated diary, Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain also gave him the resources and blessing to make his voyage to the New World. The coincidence of these two events are oft remarked upon. The violent rejection and expulsion of forms of otherness no longer acceptable to early modern Spain in their own territory was to be replaced with the construction of another sort of otherness in those whom Spain violently conquered and subdued in the New World. Meanwhile, of course, within the same time span, Europe in general was itself being sliced up afresh as a result of both Lutheran and Catholic reformations. It might be glib, therefore, though still true, to speak of this as an era of extraordinary new negotiations of alterity, otherness, both conscious and less conscious. But it is part of my argument here that John of the Cross's specifically theological contribution both encodes and exposes the fractures from that period, which still haunt Europe and the transatlantic world. John is himself thought to have been partly of so-called conversos, that is, Jewish ancestry, as was most surely the case for his great friend in the Carmelite reform, Teresa of Avila, who had Jewish ancestry. The problems of mixed blood, of renegotiated patterns of class in connection with this, and of ancestral power or poverty, hang powerfully around the discourses of both of these authors, and as I shall argue, are of a special significance for John's incisive account of various forms of inner darkness. Also, at the same time, for them, what they called the Lutheran, or as the Catholics saw it, a spiritually quietist position, was the official theological enemy. The Lutheran was the Reformed one in Germany to be opposed. And although this was supposedly the main enemy, and they were accused themselves of being, quote, Lutheran in their contemplative practices, actually they were in fact more truly at risk from their own Carmelite colleagues of a more traditional nature, from their bishops and from the Inquisition itself. In other words, this Carmelite reform was hugely political, and it was about class and identity renegotiation in a way that was seen as very threatening to the status quo. What the Carmelites looked to was a reform in which class hierarchies would be erased from their communities. The communities would become small groups of transforming identity for a new world that sought to erase the hierarchies of the old existence. So I see them as bounding ahead of themselves in their thinking. They are an implicit but profound resistance to precisely the old forms of European racialized identity and the new forms that were being made at the time. And so their analysis of inner spiritual states and their capacity for identifying the darkness of angry projection against others, as well as for the radical possibility of the undoing of existing structures of social hierarchy, was profoundly political. In this regard, the recent scholarly work from America on racism, precisely as a Christian product of a particular period or periods in early modernity or modernity, and I'm drawing here again on the complementary work of Willie Jennings and J. Cameron Carter, already mentioned in this series, has special point for my proposed theological retrieval of the thought of John of the Cross and Teresa. What Jennings and Carter show, albeit with different emphases and historical focuses, is that the modern Atlantic racial imaginary, so-called, complete with its new justification of slavery, its remainingly powerful anti-Semitism, and its great edginess about different kinds of other identity, especially the particularly threatening phenomenon of the hybrid or mixed type of race, is not only shot through with implicit Christian theological justifications, but sustained by a presumption of darkness or blackness as the problem of the other. To this often included spiritual condition of self-deceit, our own contemporary piling up of different forms of supposedly corrective identity politics and identities provides, I think, little by way of panacea. As Michelle Gonzalez has argued incisively in her recent writing, I commend to you Gonzalez's Afro-Cuban theology, which does a wonderful expose of the double thinking of these identity politics strategies. For there's a deeper problem at stake here. What the early church, and then the Desert Fathers in particular, had visualized as successive assaults of externalized demons on the monastic or ascetic subject coming from outside, are now probed afresh by John of the Cross and Teresa as inner states of self-deception in need of progressive purgation, which otherwise would be projected onto these new others. In short, already here in John, we have what we might call modern proto-psychoanalytic insights about how to deal with our own inner disease, which so often objectifies itself onto others by way of assault. So my proposal is that John of the Cross's systematic significance, theologically systematic significance, has yet even now to be fully realized. He was ahead of his time. In other words, he's not just a mystic or a writer on spirituality who is therefore not a systematic theologian who shouldn't appear in systematic theological courses. Nor is he just a superior interior guide, anticipating a lot of modern psychoanalysis, who is therefore not a cultural or political critic. Nor again is he just a poet who is therefore not rational or logical in his theological exposition. Nor finally, this is more problematic, nor in my view is he a masculinist intellectual mystic, in contrast to Theresa's complimentary stress on bodiliness and homely cataphatic metaphors. None of these stereotypes do justice to either of these great writers. All these binaries are misleading, but all have been repeated and claimed influentially again of late. But as Anna Williams has written recently in one of the few attempts to promote John as a systematic theological thinker, the San Juanist prose corpus is not, she says, a set of how-to manuals on spiritual discipline or prayer, but rather a series of reflections on the conditions under which humans can come to God and on the identity of the God who is sought in contemplation. That's quoting Williams. As we shall now see, this is a key feature of John's approach to theological anthropology, to redeeming human nature from its states of inner and outer affliction. That is, the emphasis is not on defining what such a human nature must be, but on the telos of the journey, one in which, astonishingly, human nature finds its true identity, and even potentially in this life, as being wrought into the life of the Trinity itself in union. On the way, however, there are deeply painful transitions through various overlapping forms of what John calls interior darkness, the conditions of the night of sense and the night of spirit. In this way, John of the Cross combines as acute a sense of human depravity and self-deception in sin as any Calvin or Pascal, yet with more sublime a hope for achieved union with Christ in this life than perhaps any other in the mystical traditions East and West. Why then is the account of human desire which animates and sustains the quest for God in John of the Cross so remainingly apposite, as I believe, in our own postmodern culture of the commodification of desires and at the same time of rampant racism, even despite John of the Cross's supposed ascetic negativity and elitism? It is this issue which we're now going to have to consider in the second section of this lecture. So I come to the main section here of exposition of the Carmelites, the cartography, as I call it, of desire, the mapping of desires, darkness and sin unveiled through darkness. John of the Cross wrote 4 major treatises which tell the story of human nature bound for union with God. They're called the Ascent of Mount Carmel being the place where the Carmelites were founded, and also, of course, with evocations of Elijah going up that mountain and praying and waiting for the still small voice. So the Ascent of Mount Carmel is the first text, the dark night of the soul, the spiritual canticle, and the living flame of life, of love. These are characterized, all of them, in their writing form by a rich combination of elements from John's eclectic theological repertoire. His always creative and original immersion in the biblical text, which is deep. His discerning use of classic Thomist epistemology and metaphysics, which he learnt rigorously at the University of Salamanca. His very interesting recovery of the importance of the Augustinian notion of memory, which he puts alongside the scholastic faculties of intellect and will. Memory plays a very important, the purification of memory plays a very important role in John's thinking. And his novel and highly extensive use of the language of experience and feeling as markers of inner states in relation to God. Yet what sustains each of his texts and gives to their classically measured third-person narrative an unwonted intensity is the poetic fundament of each. Each of these is based on a poem written by John. A poetry, moreover, of a dark night fired with love's urgent longings, that's the poem of the Dark Night. Of a lover who has been left wounded and moaning, that's the spiritual canticle, which is based loosely on the Song of Songs. And of a consummation which, quote, tears through the veil of this sweet encounter in the living flame. As the poetry supplies that irreducible nexus of purified erotic desire and desire for God, which runs through the entire corpus, so John also supplies us with diagrams, which are available to you, extraordinary ones, in the chat box here, and systematizes the account of this desire's necessary purgation and purification through this ascent of Mount Carmel to God. So he draws a picture, a highly sort of daringly phallic diagram for the representation of the necessary purification and detachment of all desires, not merely sexual ones, of course, but everything that causes false attachment for anything other than God. And for those who think that John of the Cross is a denier of the body, just look at these diagrams. They are diagrams of the desiring elements of the body and how through detachment from false desires, those themselves will in due course come into full enjoyment of the richness of God. When John insists in these diagrams on the famous nada, nada, not this, quote, to reach satisfaction in all, desire satisfaction in nothing, his song, he must nonetheless be using his language of annihilation of desire hyperbolically, since the final object of the entire exercise is the transformative infusion of godly desire into the contemplative waiting soul, quote, a more intense enkindling of another better love, the love of the soul's bridegroom, is necessary for the vanquishing of the appetites and the denial of this pleasure. There's also the drawing that is done from a more, quote, female perspective, which shows a kind of uterine, fallopian understanding of how this transformation is occurring. So these are highly sophisticated perceptions of how the body's and psyche's desires are progressively purified and united en route to a full enjoyment of God in union in this life. So it's a highly active, one might say, sui generis passivity of desire that characterizes the peculiar state of contemplation described by John, in which this purification starts and has to take place. And I think that's why we have this other more uterine or fallopian symbolization, because it's like a kind of gender flip that's constantly occurring in John's writing, that there is a, quote, stereotypical way in which one might perceive the passivity of contemplation as mandated, stereotypical femininity. But for John, those binaries don't work, because whatever the passivity of contemplation is, it's not the passivity that reaffirms, reinstantiates cultural femininity. And Teresa was to learn so much from John about that. The description that John gives in three important places in his corpus, in Dark Night 1, Ascent 2, and Flame 3, of the entry into the first night of sense, the disconcerting entry into the state of contemplation, I read as transcending and disturbing any fixed presumptions one might have about how we are supposedly gendered before God. What's happening in this kind of contemplation, and we can discuss it in more detail later if you wish, is that there is a kind of emptying out of the active intellect, because God is infusing into the intellect a presence through the Spirit. The intellect, as it were, is facing in this a kind of blank, and the will has to follow it and be held before God in the state of purification. And this then creates a condition in which what is going on is not in any obvious sense the performance of worldly gender as somehow stereotypically feminine to God, but rather the disconcerting acclimatization to the simple reality of a God who both fulfills and undermines all objectified representations of the Godhead, and at the same time all fixed and presumed notions of gender, or indeed of class hierarchy as well. This is a God of radical otherness, undermining whatever it is that you thought was stable in your cultural life. And that's why this purification of desire in the Night of Sense is at the same time somehow annihilating, as he says, hyperbolically. It seems to undermine everything you ever knew, but at the same time so utterly entrancing and compelling as one is drawn into the life of the dazzling darkness of God. By contrast, it is desire gone awry, gone wrong, desire missing its true goal, that for John marks the alienated state of sin. With wonderful psychological acuity, he opens the Dark Night, Book 1, when he's going to say how first our senses, our sensual life, has to be transformed, with a lengthy enumeration of the negative passions and their distorting effects on the desires of beginners, however pious they think they are, before the purification of the Night of Sense begins. Remember that he's writing here for any kind of serious Christians who maybe for a few years have meditated on the scriptures, gone to the Eucharist, and so on and so forth. This is for everybody. It's for everyone who wants to be drawn more deeply into the life of prayer. It's not an elite group. And he's very amusing here because he says, I suppose you lot will think you've made some real advances in your Christian life. And so now I'm going to puncture that idea by moving through the different capital vices, the different deadly sins, and pointing out how easy it is to be confused or utterly self-deceived about where one stands in Christian progress. And in particular, he talks about the capital vice of anger in Dark Night 1:5 in a particularly revealing way. For here he shows his understanding of the projective propulsion to blame the other for what is one's own problem, to thrust one's insecurity or what he calls peevishness onto others. And this reminds us of our analysis of Genesis 3 yesterday and that moment in the fall in which the other is blamed. This is, of course, projected darkness, as opposed to the genuine divine darkness of mysterious transformation that the Night of Sense invites us into. Once the Night of Sense begins, however, when contemplation starts, and John, as I said, is insistent that this is the lot of any serious and reasonably mature Christian, the process of serial detachment can begin, peeling away by slow degrees the false clinging to a delusion of spiritual superiority. So the Night of Sense is all about decomposing our sense of righteousness and pulling away our sensual life from attachments that keep us from spiritual union with Christ. So the Night of Sense is in due course then succeeded by the more terrible Night of Spirit, in which the soul comes to share by degrees with the total psychic disposition of Christ himself on the cross. This is described in the Ascent of Mount Carmel 2, chapter 7. So in the second night, one actually undergoes the form of dereliction that Christ himself shared with us on the cross. What is fascinating here is that John expounds no theory of Christ's redemption or atonement with any clarity, nor does his doctrine of Christ manifest itself with anything other than a veiled presence throughout his account of the 2 dark nights. And I think this is because so close is Jesus to the one being purged or purified here, that one is even unaware through the dereliction that involves of his presence until the breakthrough into union. But by then, the perspective on the cross is effectively God's own, as if one were looking down the back of Christ's neck. And we have John's own drawing of this, which was then taken up by Salvador Dali later. The idea that Christ on the cross is being perceived from the perspective of the Father, manifesting his complete identification with human dereliction. By a similar token, the experience of union itself, when it comes, is at the last an Augustinian discovery that the God one has sought has all along been more darkly intimate to one than to oneself, and indeed to all others too. John says remarkably in the Living Flame 4, "It should be known that God dwells secretly in all souls and is hidden in their substance, for otherwise they would not last." In other words, sin actually never separates us from God. It's we who think we are separated from God. The difference between the one in union and the one not so, however, for John, is that to the latter, God dwells as a sort of stranger inside his own house. But once having welcomed God home inside, however, and with all desire purified, the soul comes to inhabit, according to John, that very space within the Trinity of the breathing of the Spirit between the Father and Son. And thus, says John, the soul is somehow God through participation. The effective delight expressed by John in the spiritual canticle, and even more intensively in the Living Flame, wholly gives the lie to a vision of John as merely negative, cerebral, or hostile to the body and the affections. Here, after the lengthy and terrible purifications of both sense and spirit, the faculties are returned to the glory of their true spiritualized condition. At this point, desire, you might say, has come home to its true source, and eroticism has found its true goal. At the same time, and correlatively, the so-called darkness of sin, the darkness of falsely projected anger against any human other, as in racism, and the divine transformative darkness of the holy other God have been systematically disambiguated, but at the same time recombined in the course of union. So, Will, that's my account of John in very short measure. I think you want to ask some questions.
Indeed. I'd like to climb down the mountain with you. And let's start at the base. And let's get into the mechanics of this contemplative practice a little bit more. When I think back to the Desert Fathers, thank you, Dr. Wu, if you're out there, I kind of remember this pattern where you would have this young, inexperienced monk who would have a problem, be it anger, lust, whatever, and he would go and he would approach the Abba, the father, present his problem, and the Abba would send him back to his cell and say, go and think on it. And so he would go and think on it and then experience some sort of liberation or transcendence. And similarly, in John of the Cross, when we read the Ascent of Carmel, he says that to make the ascent of God, one must, and I quote, cast out strange gods, all alien affections and attachments, by denying these appetites and repenting of them. Now, what strikes me about this, and I mention it because it seems to me that a conscious awareness of the problem is necessary prior to the contemplative act. So must we, as white people, be aware of our own racism if contemplation is to be an effective means of addressing.
There's a chicken and egg problem here, isn't there? If we knew what we needed to know about our own entanglement in racism, there wouldn't be a problem, and there wouldn't be a ascetic project. So the moment of vulnerability in which the night of sense, according to John, starts, is a moment in which you begin to have a wobble about your own righteousness, all right? But it is just a wobble, it's a wobble. And you may need guidance even to see that something's beginning to happen, all right? But the whole point of the very painful progression through the 2 nights is that your inner self is going to be ripped open in such a way that you see what you never thought you were going to see inside yourself. And but it doesn't involve a kind of self-beating up of a self-flagellating self-righteousness, which a lot of us are engaging in right now on the white side of the church. We know we're in trouble, we have to repent, all that. But it somehow doesn't sound real. And for John, that kind of self-flagellation is a sign of inauthenticity. But it's a beginning, it's a beginning. When you step into the realm where you actually allow God to work on you in complete vulnerability in the action of contemplation, which is really God's for John, it's not actually something technically that we do, it's something we allow God to do in us. Then we descend into arenas that we had no idea that we were complicit in. So there has to be a nudge. The nudge can come from various sources, including teachers and cultural conditions. But the nudge is really coming from God, that gives us a desire to go on this journey, which is going to be probably the most disturbing journey of our life, for the sake of opening up the self to the realities of our own darkness.
If I think back to lecture 1 and your experience in the prison, would this be that type of nudge then leading you into contemplation?
Well, in my case, I had started this practice before I went into the jail. But it was part of the journey that encountering this extraordinary confrontation in a particularly oppressive political circumstance that changed the journey for me and allowed me, I hope, to see some things that I previously absolutely could not see before in terms of both my own complicity in a system of oppression, but also the transformative power of such a shared action of humility and unclinging. I mean, it's very hard to get to the heart of this practice as John describes it, and he is a bit abstract. But that diagram, the nada, 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 is about disconnecting yourself from everything to which you cling. Because everything to which you cling humanly is an impediment to the full flow of divine life in you. And you can cling to all kinds of things. You can cling to good things. You can cling to all good projects of reform.
I guess I'm wondering if we're clinging to our own implicit bias.
Of course we are. But as I've said before in this series, this category of implicit bias is terribly murky. And the tests that have been devised to test it are quite fallible, in my view. So how is it that we really encounter our prejudices and blind spots and biases and inability to love? And John would say, we can't do that by taking thought. We have to empty the intellect and the will and the memory and allow God to infuse God's self into those categories of ourself. And this will be deeply discomforting.
Right.
Isn't going to be nice. This
Right.
isn't a contemplative adventure which makes you feel better about yourself.
So let's see if Teresa says the same.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I don't know whether I love Teresa or John better. It's they're very different, and yet they were the deepest of friends. I just want to say a contrapuntal word about Teresa because I think she has extra things to say to this nexus of racism and contemplation and political reform. The standard comparison so often made between John as a supposedly mercilessly negative and disembodied ascetic, not true, and Teresa as a feminized and eroticized little woman, sort of sexualized woman mystic, turns out to be actually radically misleading. She does rather play into that stereotype in her first great writing, The Life, but after coming under John's sway, and he in very important ways under hers, she's the older person, by the way, Teresa, in fact, dropped the language of self-belittling femininity characteristic of that early life and chastened her interest in eroticized narratives of closeness to God, and instead started to write with much calmer objective confidence about the interior journey into the mansions of the soul, where she sees it, Christ lives deep within us. I don't know whether it's conscious, but Howard Thurman's talk about his fortress, his mansion, is evocative of this language of Teresa, in which the self is a very complex house, and we have to find our way into the deepest recess of it, where Christ is already living. The central features of Teresa's account of union, which come in the seventh mansion, differs markedly from John's in The Living Flame of Love. And that's because she freely acknowledges that even in the state of achieved union, distractions, irritations, temptations can still afflict us to some extent and undermine the peace that we seek in the protected castle of the self. That's again why I'm reminded of Howard Thurman's prayer that even within the fortress of his selfhood, he still has to, quote, let go of his accumulations. And whereas John of the Cross at the end of The Living Flame can drop a charming aside about how wonderfully free union can make one from business matters, at least, Teresa is under no such illusions. The work of a busy monastic reformer is too laced with external political threats on the one hand and with community stresses and strains on the other to exempt one from any such possibility. Union within the persons of the Trinity for Teresa thus goes on alongside the accustomed noise of the pots and pans in the kitchen on the one hand, and in concert with the minor and major irritations and disturbances that have to be faced by any controversial religious leader who's trying to change the world. Indeed, for John, but before his own experience of union, the writing of the spiritual canticle, the poem in it, was itself composed during a period of punitive imprisonment in a dark lavatory, the effect and outcome of jealousy and resentment among his own Carmelite brethren for his reforming efforts. So John's most important poem was written in imprisonment. He managed to escape in the classic way out of a window with the aid of some tied together sheets. So there's nothing apolitical then about these authors' accounts of transforming inner union. The inner union is, as it were, a measure of their prophetic and energized political transformations in the world and in the church. So to sum up the central message of this core section of this lecture, John of the Cross as supreme cartographer of desire in the Christian heritage, no one is so complicatedly aware of the complexities of that journey of sorting of desires, provides a complete account of false human attachments, both bodily and psychic, and of the purgation of those false desires, which correspond to the different meanings of darkness in his scheme. Darkness for John can be either sensual or spiritual first, in terms of sin. And in both cases, the effects of sin on us are noetic as well as moral. One significant form of unpurged sensual darkness, as we have seen, is projective blame of others, the distortion of the sin of anger into displaced accusation. And this, as I've argued, has particular application to the sins of contemporary racism. But underlyingly, of course, there is a more fundamental metaphysical darkness in John's system, which is not morally blameworthy in any sense, but simply the effect of the proper acknowledgement of God's radical transcendent otherness as mystery. And it is by turning into this darkness in contemplation that the purifications of the other forms of darkness can begin to be instantiated, and the withdrawal of the projection of darkness onto others undertaken. What is at stake finally is the recognition of an intimate, dazzling darkness already within the self, which is alone capable of sustaining a truly redeemed human nature, one in which desire has at last come home and found its true alignment in Christ's passion and resurrection. But what then, and finally, can John of the Cross and Teresa's systematic project of transformed desire in union possibly mean for contemporary and even secular contexts when it comes to the sins of racism? And here I come to my last section, conclusions and critical assessment. This is the point at which you may be inclined to gasp and stretch your eyes in skeptical resistance towards the proposal to which this project has so far led, and which will now be enunciated more clearly in closing. So let us indeed resummon all the force of the various hermeneutics of suspicion that I rehearsed against myself at the end of my first lecture. Recall them. The suspicion of the false submission and silencing of Black subjectivity in any contemplative religious practice. The suspicion of the false eroticization of Black bodies in such submission, and the suspicion of the loss of agency in such practice, rather than the engendering of true personal and political freedom in agency. None of these potential critiques can, of course, be gainsaid. I accept them and take them on the chin. Further, let us grasp the even more obvious nettle that must be exercising you as I speak with the Carmelites on the one hand and Thurman on the other, of the importance of inner conditions of sin, of transformation and of spiritual sensation. How on earth can these have any effects on the manifest external woes of our systematically racist outside world? Its economic deprivation, its educational incompetence, its social and political repressions, its violent policing, and its large-scale and punitive incarceration. What on earth can contemplation do for the realm of the political, the economic, and the social, where racism is concerned? I just want to offer then 3 major concluding points, and I then invite your discussion and critique. First, I want to draw attention to someone who's been exercising my interest of late, someone called Tef Poe. He's a rapper from St. Louis. His real name is Kareem Jackson, and he burst on the scene after the shooting of Michael Brown in 2014 and became one of the founders of the Hands Up United movement. Since then, his raps have admittedly become increasingly violent and angry in tone, drawing on religious themes at the same time as sexual overtones and abusive verbal riposts. And these raps reflect all the anguish and frustration of those subjected to violent policing and economic deprivation in urban neighborhoods such as St. Louis. And it's to these quite understandable, you will say, forms of violent verbal resistance, it's in comparison with these that we may be drawn to reflect again on Thurman's call to disciplined inner spiritual knowledge and forms of peaceful demonstration inspired in his day by Gandhi's project of Ahimsa. But Tefpo isn't going away, and I mention him especially at this late stage in these lectures, because it is he who has spoken so eloquently of late. I first heard him on the BBC Radio Today programme in 2016, of what he calls the profound failure of the civil rights movement and the deeper problem of racialism as he puts it, a problem of seeing, a problem of perception. Everything I've tried to say in these shaft lectures, however inadequately, suggests that he is precisely right. The system of racism is indeed a conception of sin that is found in a condition of perceptual and epistemological blindness, which we may say is so deep as to be invisible, to reapply a famous epithet of Shulamith Firestone in relation to sex class. But what then are the conditions of the alleviation of epistemic and perceptual blindness? What will shift politically and socially if this underlying problem is not attended to? What allows people to see? I have put it to you in the spirit of Thurman that this problem is a national and international spiritual malaise, arising from the fundament of sin in its deepest and most mysterious roots, and in which, of course, I participate just as deeply as anyone. And I put it to you, therefore, that it cannot be tackled solely by consciousness-raising programs or economic and political and educational healthcare reforms, crucial as all of these are. We need all these reforms more urgently than ever. But my point is, along with Tefpo's, is that they do not probe to the level of this deeper malaise. So that is the question. What are the conditions of the alleviation of mutual spiritual blindness and answering projective anger and resentment, which, as Jennings amongst others urges, keeps us so tragically as Christians from being one in Christ? Secondly, radical secular philosophers are happily now coming to our aid as Christians in the clarification and analysis of the various dimensions of the problem of racism. But we must ask to what extent their insights have force without accompanying practices of attention, solidarity, and peace. I mention only in this regard, amongst others, I put some various pieces on the bibliography, the particularly remarkable work of the Jewish secular epistemologist Miranda Fricker. For in her work on epistemic injustice, she is able to peel back something of the problem of perceptual not seeing, but with philosophical tools. She's able to peel back the different levels of epistemic self-delusion, which afflict even those who righteously disclaim their privilege and announce their solidarity with the poor and dispossessed. Her analysis of what she calls epistemic injustice draws attention not only to the issue of whose testimonies are taken seriously over others and which are not, but also to what she calls the more fundamental hermeneutical injustice, the failure in a collective interpretative resource as far as even making sense of one's experience in the first place is concerned as an oppressed person. So she's beginning to give a philosophical account of what these perceptual and epistemological blockages are, which disable us from seeing each other. Jose Medina has more recently extended Fricker's work in a more Foucauldian direction to posit the significance of shared interracial communities of resistance, to put her insights into actual political practice. So maybe we need communities that work together to diffuse these epistemological blindnesses. But what again this exciting new set of developments in epistemology and power analysis demonstrates, it seems to me, is the underlying difficulties which still press beneath its theorizing. How is the inner spiritual work of the stripping of delusion, despair, and anger to be done, if not by patient and painful practices of humility, honesty, and deepening self-knowledge? As we saw in the jail, How can the body politic be transformed, if not by the transformation of individual bodies and souls? There is another chicken and egg problem here, of course, because sometimes individuals can be transformed without institutions being transformed, but how can institutions be transformed without individuals in leadership roles in those institutions being transformed? Finally, and thirdly, I ask the obvious practical question, which will have been burning in our pockets throughout this series of lectures. What can churches do as purported purveyors of spiritual transformation after all? And what in particular can seminaries do as molders of the next generation of spiritual leaders to further this task of moral and perceptual and epistemic transformation that might begin to unravel the historic collusions of racism in this country? To put it thus, of course, is already dangerous, even delusive. I'm aware of this. It suggests that historic white churches and historic white seminaries and the white people within them, all the time, presumably unconsciously still marginalizing the non-white people in their midst, can simply roll up their sleeves and begin to fix a problem that lies within the power of their undoubted hegemony and economic force. Not so the lessons of the jail and of Thurman and indeed of the Carmelites surely all suggest. For some kind of prior interruption of the spirit must first come from the divine elsewhere, and indeed also from the dogged generosity of those who are already, as Thurman insists, so much closer to the kingdom and to the spirit from their position on the margins, from the changed consciousness of those who choose to submit themselves, whatever their supposed racial color, to the searing purification of engagement with divine luminous darkness. And then, above all, from the generous but demanding invitation of God in God's self. I leave you then with a little dream, a puny one it may seem to you, but perhaps a place to start, in the spirit of Thurman, in the spirit of the vision of the Carmelites, and all other religious reformers who are willing systematically to sit and observe at searing length their own feet of clay. What if small clusters of cooperative, interracial community or interracial cells of prayer were to pledge, even for a short time, such as in a seminary or church setting or a workplace or a jail or a hospital or a law court, to make practices of radical mutual attention in silence a transformative priority? We know enough, surely historically, from the Carmelite reformers, from the Quakers, from all churches still radically affected by the teaching of Rufus Jones and Thurman, that such an act of commitment is not only not in any way apolitical, but profoundly threatening and undermining what is still our racist status quo. In short, it gets you into trouble. It gets systemic racism into threat. But I take it that that is the sort of trouble to which the Spirit calls us. And we cannot know until we do it quite how troubling that might be. We can but dream such small dreams, for they might perhaps become big. So I thank you so much for your attention this week. And I particularly thank Edwin Van Driel and Helen Blyer and all the faculty again for their generous hospitality. And I invite now your criticism and assistance in trying to take these still unformed but purportedly systemic ideas about sin, racism, and theological anthropology a little step further forward. Thank you. Will, I think you're coming back.
I'm honored to take that little next step with you. So let's do this first. I feel that we need to address a potential danger that this contemplative approach has here in America. One of the current messages that's going around, is very popular in our culture, and it's coming out of communities of color, and rightly so, is that white silence equals violence. How will white churches practicing contemplation resist falling into this charge? does the call for contemplation pose a problem for the church's public witness?
I think it certainly does. Let's this is probably the most difficult and most profound challenge, because we all know that contemplation has become a sort of commodified American option. And the question arises, is it just a way that white Christians explore their own inner life without being destabilized into political change, or being destabilized by the other in their midst? And I think that is an absolute and real problem. And it's not so much that the silence here is a failing to speak up, because when, in my view, I said this before in answer to Eric's question on the first night, I mean, in my view, when contemplation is working fruitfully, it gives voice to prophetic speech. It isn't a silencing. It's a voluntary silence to God for the sake of transformation and prophetic and political change. So the first thing we have to do is to make a distinction between contemplation, which is simply soothing people into anesthetics, and contemplation that is destabilizing us, disturbing us. And the second problem is that I really want some help here, because it's something that's been bothering me all week and I've been discussing with Eric, amongst others. Who is meant to take the initiative in the place that we are stuck at the moment? Right. White Christians like taking initiatives, they like fixing things. And in this case, they think that the way to fix it is to do a great deal of breast beating, but it's not necessarily facing the fact that they are still in control.
Right.
The heart of contemplation is a loss of control of a very particular sort. And so I think that practice, when authentically done, is already, as it were, tilling the soil towards the ability to hand over. But what has to be spoken here is something I mentioned earlier, which is that if we are to advance in mutual understanding, repentance, forgiveness, even, dare we say it, some people think we shouldn't even use that word yet, reconciliation, then there has to be a sacrificial willingness on behalf of on the part of the oppressed to enter into this undertaking. And that is an act of loving one's enemy. Teresa says, most interestingly, that we only really know how to love our enemy when in union.
So when I first read and now heard you talk about your little dream, I want to dream a little bit more with you. And I imagine myself when I graduate from PTS, when that day comes. I imagine myself going back to rural Pennsylvania into a very small Episcopal church without any members of color. And that I decide that we want to organize a contemplative practice. Can an all-white congregation form a contemplative group and address racism without any members of color?
We're talking about pincer movements here, aren't we? So that what I'm not stating explicitly enough is that when one is in position of leadership in a church or in an academy, a university or a seminary, there is teaching and preaching, and then there is spiritual practice, and then there is practical strategic planning. And in my view, the formation of any contemplative group, if it is authentic to the propulsions of the spirit, will form a nucleus in which the conversations about racism will be different. It may be this won't immediately lead perhaps to anyone who is non-white wanting to be any part of this group. That, you know, in a situation like that, that might well not immediately happen. I spoke, I think on my first night, about how strange it was at Harvard Divinity School to be in a silent prayer group for 10 years, in which only in the latter part of that time, non-white people, for some unaccountable reason, desired to take part in it. But I think that willingness on their part came out of a wider context of activities, which I'd be hard put to pin down, but included the fact that there was a Eucharist in which they were also engaged in that community, right. That there were acts of solidarity and mercy towards the poor in the area and so on, in which we were all engaged. So it was part of a nexus of activities, which is why contemplation can never be, as it were, disconnected from those other structures. And I think I would say against myself that by concentrating so exclusively on the mechanisms of contemplation today, I would need ideally to place those in a much richer, thicker description of the other activities in which a community of contemplation is engaged.
Right. Otherwise, the real danger here is that church leaders, white leaders in all white congregations go out amongst the streets trying to find Black and brown bodies that come in, placing an undue burden upon these bodies to basically solve the problem of racism for us, because we need you as part of our
Exactly. And that's appalling. But one does have to ask, in a very small, all-white congregation, in a condition as you're describing, what is the sort of softening up process which allows for thinking unthinkable new thoughts? Right. And part of that's preaching the word, right? And that's your responsibility if you're the rector. But I think there needs to be a combination of activities here which together open that space in which the spirit can operate in ways previously unthinkable.
Right. And I guess what we're getting onto is, what would a partnership look like? How would we go about negotiating that partnership, and who would lead it?
Exactly.
Once the partnership is made.
And by the way, I mean, if you think it's my idea that, you know, the way to solve things is, you know, for me as a white priest to go to the Black Baptist church down the road and say, how would you like to come to my contemplative group? I mean, that would be an absolute flop. Right. It would be appalling. That's not what I'm suggesting, but what I am suggesting is that friendships occur at a level of depth in conditions of spiritual vulnerability, whatever those are. And locally and individually, those have to depend on all kinds of serendipitous, even miraculous occurrences of friendship and interaction, which, if we are open to the spirit, in my view, can and will happen.
Thank you. I'm going to continue to dream along with you in this, and we'll walk further.
So many questions. And we've actually had a couple of questions put in our pod by Eric, who's one of our participants off camera right now. His first question, I think, is a good one to begin with. Who are you looking to persuade?
Yeah.
Given that we're considering racism, misaggregation, desire, who's the perceived audience to whom you're systematically and theologically speaking?
Right. Of course, I quite like to convince Eric. Are you listening, Eric?
We can bring him on if you would like to try.
I've been having a good go this week. We've been having lengthy email exchange, but I mean, any theologian seeks to persuade. So the question is, I know what his question is. He's asking me, are you just talking to yourself and your white group? And of course I am talking to my white group, because I am trying to say various things to them, that the way they've set up systematic theology makes it almost impossible for it to be relevant to these issues. And in various ways, therefore, I'm seeking to convict and change the consciousness of that form of white theology. But I guess I'm seeking to at least intrigue a Black audience. If the Black audience is exceptionally annoyed, which it often is, then I want to hear why it's annoyed. I want to hear why, what are the range of objections, some of which I think I already know, to this supposition, which is, after all, sermons. That there is a spiritual project that we have in this country. And if we try and fix it by human means, we're going to reach limitations.
Despite the invocation of Thurman as one of your exemplars of contemplation, there is a lot of suspicion around contemplation and silence expressed in our chat pod.
I'm sure.
Some people are asking questions about the detachment, how we are supposed to renounce loves that seem right, like family, asking how can we truly become spiritual leaders, and isn't part of, somebody asked, is part of the tradition of contemplation that it leads to action? If a person is being changed for racial justice, is that itself the urging from the Spirit? Or is, as Will asked before, white silence the problem? This person also said, my problem with whites is that A, they truly do not listen, and B, I think they can rush into fixing stuff and playing saviors, which has been highlighted. So how would you speak once again into the suspicion, particularly among well-intentioned white folk, contemplation really could be a possibility here?
Sure. I think one of the problems here is that I have not really spelled out the claims that I want to make about sustained practice of contemplation as to its transformations. And I mean, the very first thing that contemplation should be doing is causing one to attend in a new way to God and to each other. All right. If it isn't doing that, if it isn't stopping that noise in your head about wanting to be in control and fix things from your own perspective, then it's not authentic contemplation. Secondly, it's essentially vulnerable in a good sense, not inviting abuse, but vulnerable to the Spirit's transformation, interrupting the stories that one seeks to impose. Thirdly, it introduces one to one's own inner noise, muddle, sin, prejudices, and so on and so forth. So at the very least, those features of contemplation ought to be good for whites. I mean, in terms of, at the very least. But I also want to say that what contemplation does is, over time, to break down the sensibility of individual autonomy of selfhood and introduce one to a sense of belonging to others.
Herman talks about this, doesn't he? He talks about going so deep inside himself that he comes out in the other. At one point.
Now, of course, again, all these claims are highly open to the suspicion that they are merely forms of new control and co-option. And I don't know what to say at the end of the day about that, except that taste and see, you know, that I can only look to some of the great exponents of such practice including Merton, you know, including Bonhoeffer, including people who have been at the heart of incredibly difficult political activity.
Mm-hmm.
So when contemplation is authentic, it gets one into trouble.
Mm-hmm. Might it be possible to think of different kinds of silence the way you've helpfully the opportunity to think of darkness
yeah.
ways?
Yeah, is that one of the other questions? So yes, I mean,
no, it just came to me as you were talking. Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I always like to distinguish between the silence of being silenced, which we all know what that is, of being ignored, or of even repressing oneself, and the silence that is the silence of love and attention, and which is transformative in that way, and the silence that precedes a word of great prophetic power.
Mm-hmm.
So when contemplation just becomes dozing off or not responding to political events, or is used within a community as a means of silencing members of it, all those are signs of the devil getting into this practice, which can happen, of course.
A number of people expressed some questions around ressourcement, and one person was asking if it was inappropriate to take religious reformers like Teresa and John and read this more political motivation that you have into it. They were not concerned with addressing whole social structures, this person postulates, as they were interested in reforming their own orders in the church. Are we extrapolating them as models of critique of broader political structures that perpetuate racism, and is it appropriate to do so?
Okay, I think that the problem here is that the reception of John and Teresa has been falsely interiorizing and apoliticizing. An exception here would be Rowan Williams's book on Teresa, which is actually very forceful in its exploration of her political and social impact. It's true that they got more into trouble with other religious forces than with, you know, the police. But their reforms were perceived not just as political within the Carmelite order and the Counter-Reformation Church, but as resisting forms of stratification, especially class stratification, which was itself a social and political statement. So I think we need to go back and look at the sources here as to their impact and significance. And I'm really disturbed by the way that they've been domesticated.
We have two more questions. The next one is another ressourcement question, and the last is a suggestion for resources for those interested in beginning contemplative practice. So the other ressourcement question asks, I understand the practices of the Carmelites might help transform the individual, but with regards to addressing the problem of racism, why are they a better alternative than, say, James Cone, Gustavo Gutierrez, Kelly Brown Douglas? It seems liberated theologians can aid in the transformation of individuals while speaking explicitly to the structural aspects of racism.
Sure. Again, that's a false, I should have made this clear, that's a false destruction. I'm not saying don't read Black theology. I mean, of course, we need to read Black theology. Of course, we need to know the history of racism in this country. Of course, we need to know about the Black social gospel. Of course, we need to know what has been the most important critiques of systemic racism from a Black perspective. What I'm saying is, it's striking that those resources have been present for a long time. And with TEFPO, I want to say, why isn't it working?
Mhm.
What are the conditions under which all this information, which is available, isn't changing the status quo in the churches or society? And I'm just proposing that there is a problem so deeply inscribed in our spiritual psyches. And I'm daring to say that although, of course, the oppressive side is the white side, there is also a psyche problem that my more honest Afro-American theological friends would identify as a kind of transferred self-obliteration that has come out of this whole system. So it's not that there's just a spiritual problem on one side, all right? The question is, what sort of conditions of spiritual transformation are truly changing? And I'm open to critique and suggestion on all that. Obviously, I can only speak of that which I know. But I think there may be analogues to contemplation as well in Black spiritual traditions. I've picked on those in Thurman, which strike me as particularly searching and interesting, but obviously they're not the only ones. What I am saying is I think educational resources and theological critiques are crucial, but for some reason, they don't necessarily hit the spot.
What resources might be available and recommended for the inexperienced who wish to try contemplative?
Right, well, there's a lot. There are a number of movements, as many of you know, Contemplative Outreach, Richard Rohr, these are all very readily available. They are also rather commodified, and that has its drawbacks. But I mentioned Thomas Keating the other evening, and he's recently died, but some of his basic writings on starting contemplation, which draw heavily on John of the Cross and on the Cloud of Unknowing, but place them into a modern psychological framework, are, I think, some of the best places to start. But it's a journey that requires a certain element of community, and it's a lonely task, or seems to be a lonely task if you do it on your own. So I know there are groups even within the seminary at the moment that are engaged in this. But also just reading the classics is so energizing and exciting. Reading a text like The Cloud of Unknowing from the 14th century, which is written explicitly for beginners in this task, is remarkably enlightening and fresh.
Thank you, Sarah, for being with us this week. It has been a provocative, rich discussion. We didn't even begin to touch so many of the questions in the Q&A. I will be getting back in touch with you about some of those questions. So thank you so much for your time, your generous spirit in sharing these ideas, your willingness to go deep and wrestle with them. I think you have modeled for us as well what really honest theological inquiry needs to look like. And for that, I am deeply appreciative. I would also like to give thanks to all of the wonderful colleagues who made this week possible, including our respondents, the Reverend Eric McIntosh, Robin Woodbury, and Will Robbins, our fearless coordinator in continuing ed, Lori Arnold, our IT wizards, our collaborators in Youngstown and Mahoning Valley and in the Diocese of Pittsburgh. If you are interested in further resources on racism in the church and on spirituality, please make sure you've signed up for our continuing education information. We send out a monthly newsletter, and we often address these issues in our programming and resources. Please stay tuned. In February, we'll be doing a Bible study with the co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, the Reverend Dr. Liz Theo Harris, who will be diving into dangerous texts. And our Henderson Summer Leadership Conference will feature Valerie Carr of the Revolutionary Love Project as keynoter. Again, Dr. Coakley, thank you for being with us. And Good night, everyone. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much.